The haunting wail of an infant cut through the crisp autumn air of Silver Creek, Colorado, piercing Elizabeth Foster's heart as she hurried past the whitewashed church on her way to the Mercantile. The sound stopped her dead in her tracks, compelling her to turn toward the wooden steps where a tiny bundle wrapped in a threadbare blanket lay abandoned, its face scrunched and red from crying. Elizabeth looked around frantically, searching for any sign of the baby's mother, but the dusty street remained empty in the fading October light of 1875. Her own circumstances flashed through her mind new to town, desperately seeking work after her husband's death, barely able to afford a room at the boarding house. Taking in a child was impossible, yet she couldn't just leave the infant there. As she hesitated, the thundering hoofbeats of an approaching horse drew her attention. The rider, a broad-shouldered man with a weather-beaten face partially hidden beneath a dusty Stetson, reined his chestnut stallion to a halt beside the church. His azure eyes narrowed as they took in the scene. "Madam, everything all right?" His deep voice carried a gentle quality that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. I just found this baby," Elizabeth stammered, gesturing helplessly at the wailing infant, "abandoned here on the church steps." The cowboy dismounted in one fluid motion, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the ground. He knelt beside the bundle, his calloused fingers carefully pulling back the edge of the blanket. His expression softened immediately. "Poor little fella," he murmured, then glanced up at Elizabeth. "You know whose he might be?" She shook her head, her chestnut hair falling loose from its pins. "No, I'm new in town. I was just passing by when I heard him crying." The man nodded thoughtfully before gently lifting the baby into his arms with surprising tenderness. The infant's cries immediately softened to whimpers. "Name's Jacob Thornton," he said. "I've got a ranch about 3 miles outside of town, can't just leave him here." He paused, studying Elizabeth. "You said you're new in town, got family here," Elizabeth Foster, she replied. "And no. My husband died 6 months ago. I came here looking for work." Jacob's eyes flickered with sympathy. "Found any?" "Not yet." Elizabeth bit her lip, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. She hadn't meant to reveal so much to a stranger. Jacob nodded decisively. "Well, Miss Foster, seems to me this little one needs care, and I could use an extra pair of hands at the ranch. My housekeeper, Mrs. Holloway, isn't getting any younger. If you're willing, I can offer you room, board, and fair wages to help with the baby and the house." Elizabeth blinked in surprise. "You would take in this child, just like that?" "Wouldn't be the first stray I've taken in," Jacob said with a slight smile. "Got 3 dogs and a one-eyed cat that'd agree. Besides, can't leave a baby to fend for himself, can we?" The offer seemed heaven-sent. Elizabeth had nearly exhausted her meager savings, and the prospect of secure employment with lodging was more than she had dared hope for. Still, she hesitated. "You don't know anything about me, Mr. Thornton." "I know you stopped for a crying baby when others walked on by," he replied simply. "That tells me enough for now. The rest we can figure out along the way." The baby had quieted now, his tiny hand clutching Jacob's finger. Elizabeth felt something shift in her chest, a strange mixture of fear and hope. "All right," she decided. "I accept your offer, Mr. Thornton." "Jacob," he corrected with a gentle smile. "If we're going to be caring for this little one together, might as well use first names." He helped Elizabeth onto his horse before mounting behind her, cradling the infant securely between them. As they rode out of town, Elizabeth wondered what she had gotten herself into, but the warm presence of the cowboy at her back and the weight of the baby against her chest somehow felt right, like the beginning of something she hadn't known she was looking for. The Thornton Ranch came into view as they crested a gentle hill, the setting sun casting long shadows across the sprawling property. A modest but well-maintained 2-story house stood sentinel, flanked by a large barn and several outbuildings. Cattle dotted the distant pastures and smoke curled invitingly from the chimney. "It's beautiful," Elizabeth murmured. "It's home," Jacob replied, his deep voice resonating close to her ear. "Been in my family for 3 generations now. Mrs. Holloway, a stout woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes, met them at the door with an expression that shifted rapidly from surprise to curiosity to practical determination when she spotted the baby. Land's sakes, Jacob Thornton, what have you brought home this time? Her hands were already reaching for the infant, found him abandoned at the church steps, Jacob explained, dismounting and helping Elizabeth down. This is Miss Elizabeth Foster. She'll be staying with us to help care for the boy. Mrs. Holloway's shrewd eyes assessed Elizabeth briefly before she nodded. Well, don't just stand there. Bring the child inside. He'll need milk and a proper wrapping, and this poor girl looks like she could use a hot meal herself. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Jacob rode to town to inform the sheriff about the abandoned baby, while Mrs. Holloway showed Elizabeth to a cozy bedroom and helped her prepare a makeshift cradle from a dresser drawer. They fashioned diapers from soft flannel sheets and warmed cow's milk diluted with water for the hungry infant. By the time Jacob returned, Elizabeth was seated by the fire in the main room, rocking the now sleeping baby. The sheriff had promised to make inquiries, but Jacob's expression suggested he hadn't held out much hope of finding the mother. Poor woman must have been desperate, Elizabeth said softly, looking down at the peaceful face. I know what it's like to feel you have nowhere to turn. Jacob settled into the chair opposite her, his tall frame seeming too large for the modest furniture. After your husband died. Elizabeth nodded. Thomas was a good man, but he left debts I couldn't pay. The bank took our home in Denver. I had nothing left but the clothes on my back and what little I could carry. I'm sorry, Jacob said, genuine compassion in his voice. Losing someone you love is never easy. We were only married a year, Elizabeth admitted. It was a marriage of convenience more than love, though I cared for him deeply. He was 20 years my senior, a friend of my father's who offered to take care of me after my parents died of influenza. Jacob studied her thoughtfully. How old are you, Elizabeth? 22, she replied. Though some days I feel much older, he nodded, understanding in his eyes. At 30, Jacob had seen his share of hardship too. The war had taken his brother, and running the ranch alone had aged him beyond his years. What shall we call him? Elizabeth asked, changing the subject as she gazed down at the baby. Jacob moved to kneel beside her chair, studying the infant's features. A shock of dark hair topped a round face with surprisingly long eyelashes. He looks like a Samuel to me, Sam for short. Samuel, Elizabeth repeated, testing the name. I like it, Samuel Thornton. Jacob's eyes met hers, something unspoken passing between them. They both knew this arrangement was temporary, that the sheriff might find the mother, or that the baby might be placed with a proper family. But for now, in the warm glow of the firelight, they allowed themselves to pretend this fragile connection might last. Days turned into weeks as autumn deepened toward winter. No one came forward to claim baby Samuel, and the sheriff eventually closed his inquiry. Jacob filed papers to become the child's legal guardian, a process simplified by his standing in the community and the circumstances of abandonment. Elizabeth settled into life at the ranch with surprising ease. Mrs. Holloway taught her to cook properly. Her city upbringing had left her woefully unprepared for country life, while Jacob showed patience with her other limitations. She learned to gather eggs without frightening the hens, to churn butter until her arms ached, and to tend the vegetable garden that would sustain them through the coming winter. Samuel thrived under their care, growing plumper by the day. His first real smile came one morning as Jacob dangled a pocket watch above his cradle, the infant's delight bringing an answering grin to the cowboy's usually serious face. Elizabeth paused in the doorway, laundry basket balanced on her hip, struck by the tenderness in Jacob's expression as he played with the baby. Something warm unfurled in her chest at the sight, something she didn't dare name. He likes you, she said softly. Jacob glanced up, a hint of color touching his tanned cheeks at being caught in such a gentle moment. Got good taste, doesn't he? He replied with a wink that made Elizabeth's heart flutter traitorously. Mr. Tom Jacob, she corrected herself, still struggling with the familiarity after weeks of cohabitation. I wanted to thank you again for taking us in. I don't know what would have happened to either of us if you hadn't come along that day. His expression grew serious. No need for thanks. Having you both here has been. He hesitated, searching for the right words. It's been good. The house feels more like a home now. The look that passed between them lingered a moment too long for comfort. and Elizabeth hurriedly returned to her chores, unsettled by the warmth spreading through her body. That evening, as the first snow of the season began to fall, Jacob sat on the porch despite the cold, staring out at the white flakes illuminated by the lantern light. Elizabeth, having settled Samuel for the night, brought him a cup of coffee and hesitantly joined him on the bench. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Jacob nodded, taking a sip from his cup before setting it aside. "First snow always makes me think of my mother. She loved winter, said it made everything clean and new again." "Is she?" Elizabeth left the question unfinished. "She passed 5 years ago. Father followed a year later, left the ranch to me and my brother, but then Robert died at Gettysburg." Jacob's voice held old pain, well worn but still present. "Been just me since then. Well, me and Mrs. Holloway." "It must get lonely," Elizabeth said softly. Jacob turned to look at her, snowflakes catching in her chestnut hair and on her eyelashes. It did, not so much anymore. Their gazes held, and Elizabeth felt something shift between them, a boundary crossing neither had acknowledged until now. Impulsively, she reached out and covered his hand with hers. "I was so afraid when Thomas died," she confessed. "Not just about money or shelter, but about being alone. I've never been good at being alone." Jacob turned his hand beneath hers, interlacing their fingers. His palm was rough with calluses but warm against her skin. "You're not alone anymore, Elizabeth." For a breathless moment, she thought he might kiss her, but a particularly strong gust of wind swept across the porch, making her shiver. Jacob immediately stood, tugging her gently to her feet. "Come inside before you catch your death," he said, his voice gruff with an emotion Elizabeth dared not name. That night, lying in her bed listening to Samuel's soft breathing from his cradle, Elizabeth acknowledged the truth she'd been avoiding. She was falling in love with Jacob Thornton. The realization terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. What had begun as an arrangement of necessity had become something far more complicated and precious. As winter settled over the Colorado wilderness, life at the Thornton Ranch fell into a comfortable rhythm. The days were filled with work feeding livestock, mending fences, preserving food, and caring for Samuel, who grew more alert and engaging by the day. The evenings brought a different kind of intimacy as the three of them, along with Mrs. Holloway, gathered around the fire, sharing stories and simple pleasures. Jacob taught Elizabeth to play checkers, his patient instruction belied by his competitive spirit that emerged once she began to improve. She, in turn, read aloud from the few books in the house, her clear voice bringing the stories to life as Jacob whittled wooden toys for Samuel. It was during one such evening in early December that disaster struck. Mrs. Holloway had retired early with a headache, and Elizabeth had just laid Samuel down for the night when a frantic pounding at the door startled them both. One of Jacob's ranch hands, Travis, stood on the porch, his face pale beneath his beard. "Fire at the north pasture line, boss." Lightning hit that old oak, winds pushing it toward the winter grazing land. Jacob was already reaching for his coat. "Wake the others, get every able hand out there with whatever can hold water." He turned to Elizabeth, his expression grim. "Stay here with Samuel and Mrs. Holloway. If the wind shifts and the fire comes this way, take the wagon and head to town." Before she could respond, he was gone, disappearing into the swirling snow with Travis. Elizabeth spent a sleepless night pacing by the window, watching the distant orange glow on the horizon, praying for Jacob's safety. When dawn finally broke, she could no longer stand the waiting, bundling Samuel warmly and leaving a note for Mrs. Holloway. She hitched the wagon, a skill Jacob had insisted she learn, and set out toward the north pasture. The acrid smell of smoke reached her long before she saw the blackened remains of the old oak and the scorched earth surrounding it. Men moved wearily among the smoldering remnants, their faces streaked with soot. Elizabeth's heart clenched when she didn't immediately spot Jacob. One of the hands noticed her and approached the wagon. "Madam, you shouldn't be out here." "Where's Jacob?" she demanded, clutching Samuel tighter. The man hesitated. "Boss took a bad fall when part of the tree came down. Doc Jenkins is with him in the bunkhouse." Elizabeth's world tilted dangerously. Without conscious thought, she was moving, cradling Samuel against her chest as she hurried toward the bunkhouse. heedless of the mud and ash clinging to her skirts. She found Jacob lying on a narrow bed, his left arm bandaged and his face unnaturally pale beneath a layer of soot. Dr. Jenkins, a portly man with kind eyes, was just finishing wrapping a bandage around Jacob's ribs. "Jacob," Elizabeth gasped, drawing both men's attention. "What are you doing here?" Jacob tried to sit up, wincing in pain. "You should have stayed at the house." "Dislocated shoulder and 2 cracked ribs," Dr. Jenkins informed her, ignoring Jacob's protests. "He'll live, but he won't be much use around the ranch for at least 6 weeks. "I'll be back on a horse in 2, Jacob growled. "Not if Miss Foster here has any sense, you won't," the doctor countered, packing his bag. "Make sure he rests, young lady. I'll check on him in a few days." As the doctor left, Elizabeth approached the bed, tears pricking her eyes as she took in Jacob's injuries. "You could have been killed." "Takes more than a falling tree to kill a Thornton," he replied, but his attempt at humor fell flat as another wave of pain crossed his features. Samuel, who had been remarkably quiet until now, began to fuss. Jacob's expression immediately softened. "Bring him here." Elizabeth carefully placed the baby beside Jacob on the narrow bed. Samuel immediately reached for the cowboy's unshaven face, a toothless grin appearing. "Hey there, little man," Jacob murmured. "Been taking care of your mama while I was gone." The casual way he referred to her as Samuel's mother caught Elizabeth off guard. A lump formed in her throat as she watched the man and baby together, the tenderness between them undeniable. "We need to get you back to the house," she said when she could trust her voice again. "You'll recover better in your own bed." Jacob didn't argue, which told Elizabeth more about his pain level than his stoic expression. With the help of 2 ranch hands, they got him into the wagon for the journey home. The following weeks tested Elizabeth in ways she hadn't anticipated. Running the household while caring for both Samuel and an increasingly restless Jacob required all her energy and patience. Jacob, unused to inactivity, made for a difficult patient despite his efforts to hide his discomfort. "I should be out there," he said one afternoon, watching through the window as his men brought in the cattle for winter feeding. "Spring roundup is coming, and there's 100 things that need doing before then." Elizabeth, who was mending one of his shirts by the fire with Samuel asleep in his cradle beside her, set down her needle. "Your men are capable. Travis has everything well in hand." "It's my responsibility," Jacob insisted, frustration evident in his voice. "My father built this ranch from nothing. I can't just lie here while what?" Elizabeth interrupted, her own frustration bubbling over. "While people who care about you make sure you heal properly, is accepting help so terrible, Jacob?" He turned to look at her, surprise replacing irritation in his expression. "People who care about me," Elizabeth felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she didn't look away. "Yes, people who care, Mrs. Holloway, your ranch hands," she swallowed hard. "Me." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Jacob crossed the room slowly, favoring his injured side until he stood directly before her chair. "How much?" he asked, his voice rough. "How much do you care, Elizabeth?" Her heart hammered against her ribs as she stood to face him. "More than I should. More than makes sense for a woman who came into your life as a charity case with an abandoned baby." Jacob's good hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "You were never a charity case. From the moment I saw you on those church steps, something in me knew." "Knew what?" she whispered. "That I'd been waiting for you, for both of you." His gaze flickered to the sleeping Samuel before returning to her face. "I know it's too soon. You're still grieving your husband, and we've only known each other a few months. But Elizabeth—" She silenced him by rising onto her tiptoes and pressing her lips to his, a bold move that surprised them both. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but deepened as Jacob's arm circled her waist, drawing her closer despite his injured ribs. When they finally parted, both breathless, Elizabeth rested her forehead against his chest. "I wasn't in love with Thomas," she confessed quietly. "I cared for him deeply as a friend, but what I feel for you, it's different. It scares me how different it is." Jacob tilted her chin up, his blue eyes intense. "I love you, Elizabeth Foster, I love you, and I love that baby boy as if he were my own flesh and blood." I want us to be a real family, not just an arrangement, not just for convenience. I want forever with you both." Tears spilled freely down Elizabeth's cheeks now. "Are you asking me to marry you, Jacob Thornton?" "I am," he confirmed, a smile breaking across his face. "Though I imagine doing it with a bit more ceremony and a lot less pain in my side." Elizabeth laughed through her tears. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you." Their second kiss was interrupted by Samuel's awakening cry, a sound that made them both laugh. "He has perfect timing," Jacob said, moving to lift the baby with his good arm. "Don't you, son?" The word son hung in the air between them, full of promise and commitment. Elizabeth watched as Jacob gently bounced Samuel, soothing his fussing, and she knew with sudden clarity that this was what home felt like, not a place, but these two people who had come into her life by chance or providence. As the winter slowly gave way to spring, Elizabeth and Jacob were married in the same church where Samuel had been found. The baby, dressed in a tiny suit Jacob had specially ordered from Denver, was held by Mrs. Holloway during the ceremony, though he reached persistently for his parents throughout. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the preacher declared to the small gathering of friends and ranch hands. "You may kiss your bride." As Jacob's lips met hers, sealing their vows, Elizabeth felt the final pieces of her heart lock into place. The journey that had begun in grief and uncertainty had led her to a love and family she'd never dared dream possible. Later that evening, after the modest celebration had ended and they were alone in the bedroom they would now share, Jacob pulled a document from his coat pocket. "A wedding gift," he said, handing it to Elizabeth. "I had the lawyer draw it up last week." Elizabeth unfolded the paper, her eyes widening as she read. "Adoption papers," Jacob nodded, his expression solemn. "Samuel deserves our name legally, not just in our hearts. If you agree, he'll be Samuel Thornton in the eyes of the law as well." Tears blurred Elizabeth's vision as she set the paper aside and wrapped her arms around her husband's neck. "I agree with all my heart." Their kiss was a promise to each other and to the sleeping child in the next room. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as a family forged not by blood but by love and choice. Spring roundup came and went, followed by a summer of abundant rain that turned the pastures lush and green. Samuel took his first steps in the yard under the watchful eyes of both parents, falling more often than not, but laughing with delight at his new mobility. On a warm September evening, almost exactly a year after the day Jacob had found Elizabeth and Samuel on the church steps, the family sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Samuel, now a sturdy toddler with Jacob's determined expression and Elizabeth's gentle eyes, played with wooden blocks at their feet. "I have something to tell you," Elizabeth said, her hand finding Jacob's as it often did in quiet moments. He turned to her, one eyebrow raised in question. "We're going to need another cradle," she said softly. "Samuel is going to be a big brother come spring." Jacob's face transformed with wonder as her meaning registered. In one fluid motion, he lifted her from her chair and spun her around, his laughter joining hers in the evening air. "Careful." She gasped through her giggles. "The baby," he set her gently on her feet but kept his arms around her waist. "Another baby," he whispered, awe in his voice. "Our baby." "Our baby," she confirmed, resting her hand over his where it splayed protectively across her still flat stomach. "Our family keeps growing." Samuel toddled over to them, arms raised in the universal request to be included. Jacob lifted him easily, settling the boy on his hip as he wrapped his other arm around Elizabeth. "What do you think, Sam?" Jacob asked seriously. "Ready to be a big brother?" Samuel's response was a happy babble that made both parents laugh. As the last rays of sunlight gilded their faces, Elizabeth looked at her husband and son, soon-to-be sons, or perhaps a son and daughter, and marveled at how completely her life had transformed. From a destitute widow to a beloved wife and mother. From alone and afraid to surrounded by love and security. All because a baby cried on the church steps, and a cowboy with a heart as vast as the Colorado sky had stopped to help. "I love you," she whispered to Jacob as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "I love our life together." His kiss was gentle, a tender affirmation of shared dreams and promises kept. "And this is just the beginning," he murmured against her lips. "Just the beginning of our forever." As night settled fully over the Thornton ranch, the little family made their way inside, closing the door on the vast wilderness beyond. Within those walls, in the home they had built together, love had transformed strangers into family, proving once again that the strongest bonds are those we choose to forge, day by day, heart by heart.